Thank you so much, Lowkey, for sitting with me again today in London. There's so often times that I wish we could just talk music, but circumstances being what they are right now, there's certain pressing matters I feel we have to tend to first, and thank you for joining me in that regard.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm hoping that we can talk about the ongoing riots and the hatred that seems to be animating them, if you will, and the potential, or the possibility rather, that the UK establishment has in either being complicit or promoting or endorsing them. But before we get into that in earnest, I'm wondering if you can speak to how you first heard about the riots and what your reaction was.
Well, to start with, I was not massively surprised or shocked. When you understand the confluence of issues that have come together, you can see that there was seeds of this form of dissent and unrest many years ago. So to start with, what you have is people who are simultaneously disaffected and misdirected. So on one hand, they are disaffected by an economic system which has pushed this country to a point where there has been no increase in real wages since 2008, where 50% of the land is owned by 1% of the population. And of course, that 1% of the population that owns that 50% of the land is certainly not the people that a lot of the energy is being aimed at and the blame is being put upon. Also, you have to remember that only 2% of the land in this country is used for building at all. So you have 1% of the land that's used for housing. So with a population increase, you do not have a political system which is responding to that by building housing. So the disaffection comes from several different aspects of this. 33% of all children in this country are in poverty. You have a situation where even infant mortality is increasing. Britain is comparatively the poorest country in Europe now. When you look at previous to the financial crash of 2008, Britain had a higher per capita GDP than the United States, than France, than other major European countries. Now, Britain's GDP per capita is 50% that of the United States. So clearly there is a loss of agency that has happened, but there is a fault, I would say, in the diagnosis of the issue. There's been a loss of agency. Since the Thatcher years, you've had all manner of the key functions of the state privatized, not only to private companies, but to foreign state companies, but also offshore capital, so companies based in tax havens. For instance, how many of us are aware that the top shareholder in British Royal Mail, that key bastion of Britishness, is actually Vesta Equity, which is based in the Luxembourg tax haven? There's an acknowledgement that people are losing agency, but the problem is they have been encouraged to see this in a lens of horizontal hatred and vertical solidarity, which renders invisible the offshore capital, which is siphoning off the belongings of the population of this country, and they direct it towards a very small and vulnerable section of society that also interacts in a very toxic way with a lot of the war on terror propaganda. We cannot forget that Britain has been involved in wars over these last 2 decades, which have caused the end of life for millions of people and the displacement of tens of millions of people. Now, that could not have happened without the dehumanization and the demonization of the people who are elected to be the worthy victims of this violence. In order for you to depict Britain's imperial adventures and work as a helper of the United States, you have to depict it or contextualize it as victimless violence. So therefore, the over 1 billion Muslims in the world are thus stripped of their humanity. And there has been all manner of myth creation which has buttressed that understanding. And who do you think would be the cannon fodder for Britain's wars across these last 2 decades. It is the very people that you currently see on the streets attempting to burn hotels because they are enraged by 0.6% of the population who are people seeking asylum. The British military has burnt buildings across the world, occupied by some of the same people that are now in this country. We're talking about people that have fled Britain and US wars, coming here, being met with this level of animosity. And that is all manufactured. That has to be cultivated within people. That doesn't exist inherently within people in this country. In fact, reality is the biggest factor which disproves the theory, because on a day-to-day basis, the entire economic system, the entire logistics of society rely upon cooperation between people that, unfortunately, a small section of the society seem to believe are impossible compatriots to start with. You're being told that there's no way that this group of people can coexist within this society. But the entire reality that we live is at odds with that. You also have to remember that this is a society that has had visited upon it a particularly aggressive form of neoliberalism, which has hollowed out the state. And that has run simultaneous to an attempt to take the grievances that people have and lay them squarely on the most vulnerable in the society as a scapegoat for all of those problems. For instance, when we look at the development of Tommy Robinson and the English Defence League, I think it's important to start right at the beginning. Now, the English Defence League, when first founded, was co-founded by an individual that calls himself Paul Ray. But who was Paul Ray? Paul Ray was somebody who infiltrated and spied on the International Solidarity Movement. This was the activist group in Palestine that Rachel Corrie had been a member of. Rachel Corrie, of course, killed under an Israeli bulldozer in Gaza. Now, Paul Ray infiltrated this organization and submitted that information to multiple intelligence agencies, including Israel. Following that, he came back to England and founded the English Defence League, which, again, you have to remember was a direct extension of the war on terror. It was about people in Luton, supposedly, protesting against the British Army and its crimes in Iraq specifically. And so then in response to that, the English Defence League is formed. But there's another aspect to the English Defence League which requires deeper examination. So when the English Defence League was first registered on Companies House, it was registered by a former Israeli soldier by the name Roberta Moore. Now, Roberta Moore headed what was described to be the Jewish division of the English Defence League. Now, Roberta Moore was somebody closely linked to the JDL. The JDL, the Jewish Defence League, is designated as a terrorist organization by the United States. It is the brainchild of Israeli fascist Meir Kahane, who of course advocated for the full annihilation, displacement and ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Now, Roberta Moore was asked, is the English Defence League exploiting the Zionist movement by having involvement with her? And she said, if anything, we are exploiting them. The EDL and the English Defence League in its early days held its rallies outside the Israeli embassy with the Zionist Federation. So you have very close coordination between Roberta Moore and Jonathan Hoffman, the vice chair of the Zionist Federation at the time. What's even more fascinating is that Roberta Moore in 2013 changed the name of the English Defence League on Companies House to the Jewish Defence League. So clearly there's a relationship between the JDL and the EDL, and it doesn't end there. One of the earliest advocates for the EDL and someone who spoke on their platforms at their rallies outside the Israeli embassy to support them was Rabbi Nachum Shifrin. Now, Rabbi Nachum Shifrin was the driver for Meir Kahane, the founder of the JDL. And it goes even further than that, Sheila Gower, for example, was Tommy Robinson's personal assistant. Now, she also registered the English Defence League on Company's House. When she first registered it, she registered it as the English and Jewish Defence League. So you clearly have some very interesting connections here between the JDL as an organization and the EDL. In fact, you could be forgiven for thinking that the EDL was initially founded to be an offshoot of the JDL in this country. Now, that is something that everybody should take seriously. And then when you look at the trajectory of the rest of Tommy Robinson's political career, he was someone that went on after his time founding the English Defence League and working on that to really be rehabilitated in an interesting way by the Quilliam Foundation. But who, of course, was the Quilliam Foundation? It is the brainchild of Majid Nawaz. They worked very closely with the British Home Office as an attachment to the war on terror. They produced lists which were given to the Home Office of quote-unquote extremist Muslims who were then policed in a tougher way. But also, when you look at the funding of the Quilliam Foundation, you find several organizations who simultaneously were investing in the building of illegal Israeli settlements. You find several organizations who also fund the Friends of the IDF organization. And so Tommy Robinson, following the EDL era, was rehabilitated by Majid Nawaz and the Quilliam Foundation. But the Quilliam Foundation played a particularly toxic role in the trajectory of what we're talking about here, and I will explain how. Around 8 to 10 years ago, the Quilliam Foundation released a study which, honestly, when I have looked at the methodology deeply, it should have been illegal, what they did. They took around 85 criminal cases with around 240 offenders. Now, they extrapolated from those cases, and we have no way of knowing how they chose those cases. They extrapolated from those cases that 84% of all quote-unquote grooming gang cases were Pakistani men. Now, those cases, those around 80 cases, were across a 12-year period. In 1 year alone, according to the Office of National Statistics, the amount of reports of sexual assault that take place are in the tens to over 100,000. Now, you're telling me that over a 12-year period, 80 cases or so could somehow be used to extrapolate this figure of 84%. Now, that 84% figure was pumped out across the entirety of the British media without any critical comment, as if it was fact. This was a lesson in fact creation. And so the idea was pushed across the country and a forming of a new reality existed. Ultimately, these are psychological warriors who believe that perception matters more than reality, and perception informs reality, not reality informing perception. And so thus, statistics were fiddled with to create a common sense perception among the population that there were particular sections of that population who had some form of inclination towards not only physical violence, but also sexual violence. When you examine, for example, Tommy Robinson, outraged that he was stopped under the Schedule 7 Terrorism Act. So what is the Schedule 7 Terrorism Act? It is an act whereby the police can detain somebody, in some cases 9 hours, but now we're seeing cases of that being extended, but it's illegal for the person not to answer a question asked of them. They have to submit all of their electronic devices. Now, Tommy Robinson was outraged that he had been stopped under this legislation. But does he know that you are 154 times more likely to be stopped under that legislation if you are deemed to be an IC4, a Pakistani man? Does he know that 80% of the 500,000 people that have been stopped under that legislation are ethnic minorities, despite the fact they are only 13% of the population? And so what has taken hold are very creative mythologies, which have then been used to do two things: inform legislation, which discriminates directly. This myth of a two-tier policing system where Muslims are somehow advantaged in British law is absolutely counterfactual. It goes against every single empirical study of this. How do you explain that 40% of the prison population are ethnic minorities when they're only 13% of the population? How do you explain the Macpherson report, which found that the police had a problem with institutional racism? How do you explain all of those things? What they've attempted to do is engineer the society through algorithmic targeting with psychological operations. And that's what's taken place. Tommy Robinson is merely a creature of the war on terror, which necessitated the demonization of humans en masse in order to buttress industrial killing. Now, when you consider that Tommy Robinson went on to be a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, Robert Shillman, who funded his position, was simultaneously a director of the Friends of the IDF. In addition to that, Tommy Robinson was funded by the Middle East Forum. Now, the Middle East Forum is headed by Greg Roman, who's a former employee of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Israeli Ministry of Defense. These are not coincidental. There is a direct alignment of interests in achieving specific objectives. The massive mobilization of people in this country to support the Palestinians, which included the activity of Palestine Action, shutting down hundreds of times Israeli arms interests in this country. What can we say to the sentences now being meted out to people for ultimately there was a manufacturing of consent for what has happened now, and you are seeing disproportionate sentences meted out to these individuals who have been sent into the street as cannon fodder to fight an extension of the war on terror in this country. Now what has happened in addition to that is you've seen Palestine Action have several members held under terrorism legislation without charge, which means they can be interrogated and are legally forced to answer the questions asked of them for a week, and up to 2 weeks this could happen. So this is all happening at the same time. This is the shock doctrine. This is the shock doctrine. You have the initial push, which contains the spectacle, the spectacular violence, the horrifying violence, which scares people. But then you have the aftermath, which is when the state changes laws and applies those laws across the board. So unfortunately, we have people that would look at what has happened and cheer on the criminalization of many of these people in the street. I still perceive them as victims. They're victims of an economic system, firstly, but they're also victims of propaganda. And the victimization by the law which is visited upon them will also be used to smash the rest of us.
You know, this is so interesting, this concept of myth creation. And I want to return to these notions, or what I feel you were alluding to regarding notions of neoliberalism and austerity. But do you feel that part of this myth creation is the deliberate omission of the anti-Palestinian or Zionist components of these riots? Because people, I feel, largely know that they're far right. They're being characterized across the spectrum, or at least in the liberal media, as far right. But there seems to be just very little on the anti-Palestinian and Zionist component or connection. And I'm wondering, do you feel this is deliberate? Because we're also seeing it like among the so-called progressive or liberal media. And I find this a little bit strange if you're supposed to be advocating for universal human rights.
So to start with, British military expert on terrorism, Chris Hunter, found that in this country, you have 1 in 16 million chance of being near an act of political violence, i.e. terrorism. In fact, you're 100,000 times more likely to die in a car accident. You're 4 times more likely to be struck by lightning. In fact, Danny Dorling of Oxford University found that this is prior to COVID, 130,000 people died, preventable deaths, because of austerity. So you are therefore statistically more likely to be killed by austerity than you are to be killed by terrorism in this country. However, the necessity of the foreign policy, which of course is integrated with Israel and its actions in Gaza, it renders threat inflation an absolutely essential part of everyday life, of the mood music. So you have to have a warped understanding of your likelihood to be in danger. Now, when it comes to identifying the Zionist aspect of the funding for these groups, for instance, Sarah Marusek has a wonderful chapter in the book Islamophobia, Social Movements from Above, where she found that 75% of the organizations invested in the Islamophobia network, which is the think tanks which push out this fake news, essentially manufactured narrative about Muslims, are also invested in the building of illegal settlements in the West Bank. So you have direct material relationship between these organizations. Now, unfortunately, because of the aggressiveness of the Israel lobby in this country, both on a granular, a micro, and on a macro level, you have a very well-disciplined media and political class, which almost a requirement of the job is to look the other way. Now, the same process has played out by stealth among a lot of the left organizations. Through seeing the victimization of other people and the spectacle of people suffering when they spoke out against the Israel lobby, people are almost averse. There's almost an aversion to actual research into this issue. Everything that I've said about Tommy Robinson is easily verifiable through publicly accessible documents. However, because people have a knee-jerk instinctive push to ignore this information and also to fit reality within their ideological conception, which says that ultimately we band together as a society to fight, which of course I don't disagree with. However, the difference is that we have spent decades studying the activity of Israel and its state apparatus. We've also studied the way that it uses proxies to extend its influence in different ways. And so for that reason, it's really not a controversial topic. It's not a controversial issue. Tommy Robinson has for many years been backed by very significant Zionist actors who seem to believe they have a shared interest in Tommy Robinson's project in this country.
Yeah, Lowkey, to return to the issue of neoliberalism and austerity, I'm just wondering how perhaps an enhanced political economic consciousness could challenge what it's doing in terms of dividing people and where that would begin.
So to start with, the neoliberal project was something advocated for in the 30s in parts of Europe in order to push back against totalitarianism. However, the way it was translated in the 70s by Hayek and others, it was about the elevation of the individual above the state. But what that also meant was that the corporation would be perceived to be a better provider of the functions that the state historically provided. So in the British context, you had the Thatcher regime, which, while simultaneously peddling a form of nationalism, had literally within the Conservative Party a group of people that were carrying out a process of what they called denationalization. And so that was the denationalization of the major utilities of society. You have over 70% of the population here that want the water in public ownership. You have almost 80% of the population that want the railway in public ownership. This is very much a widely held feeling. However, what happened during the Thatcher years and John Major and Tony Blair after that was they took these key functions of the state and gave them to not only foreign state companies like German or Italian companies or French state companies, but also they gave them to companies based in tax havens. And so there is a process of disempowerment which has played out across this time, where people have an instinctive awareness that they are being lied to, and that also they are being disempowered in some way. Now, to deal with a lot of those manifestations, you also simultaneously had a push which was about placing the problems that come from that onto the shoulders of the poorest. If you look at the percentage of the British population which takes the vast majority comparatively, you're looking at 1%, the richest 1% of the British population, which takes 20%, almost 20% of the national income today. Okay, we're talking pre-World War I level of inequality. We're not talking pre-World War I level of poverty, we're talking pre-World War I level of inequality. Around the time when Thatcher came into power, you actually had the top 1% of the population taking 6% of the national income and only 4% after tax. So you had a greater, more equal distribution of wealth within the society and a smaller disparity between the rich and the poor. Yes, there was racism. Yes, it had links to pushes by particular toxic figures who were again trying to say that any grievances that people had were to be blamed on the alien newcomer from elsewhere. But in this case, of course, the people being demonized and being scapegoated are not alien. They are people that are from former British colonies. So, for example, a large proportion of those that come to the country are from Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been invaded and occupied by the British 4 times in the last 2 centuries. The first time that bombs were ever introduced to Afghanistan, it was by the British military. In fact, the borders of Afghanistan were built by the British. There are people also coming from Iran. How many people here know about the British coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, the prime minister in the 50s, who wanted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which went on to become British Petroleum? How many people are aware, when talking to people from Sudan, that literally Khartoum, the capital city of Sudan, was supposed to be built in the shape of the Union Jack? That the leader of the Sudanese resistance to the British, and Mehdi, he was killed and his skull was then used in the office of the British governor of Sudan, Kitchener. How many people know about this history and the way in which many of the people coming to this country actually know England in a way that many of the English don't know England, because they have been visited by British imperial adventure. You have to remember that Britain at its zenith occupied over 14 million square miles of the planet. In fact, Boris Johnson, of all people, said very clearly there's only about 20 countries in the world that Britain didn't occupy. When you look at the aftermath of World War II, you had figures like Oswald Mosley and others trying to blame the conditions that people found themselves in on those that had come following the British Nationality Act of 1947. At the time when that legislation was passed, it said that anybody from anywhere within the British Commonwealth was able to come to Britain because they were British citizens. It wasn't until 1962, when the Commonwealth Act was passed, that that right was stripped away from people. There has to be a key understanding here. Britain didn't have an empire, Britain was an empire. And even today, you have in the aftermath of the empire an archipelago of British tax havens across the world, from the Channel Islands to the Cayman Islands to Jersey and other places. Now, these tax havens are responsible for 37% of all tax losses that governments face around the world. Why does Britain have the right to funnel money out of other people's economies, but then does not think that there is any consequence to that type of activity? Literally 1 in 10 British soldiers is a foreign national. So you are talking about a state that has not only a colonial past, but a colonial present. And it's interesting because at the end of the colonial, when it was winding down, shall we say, you had over 1 million Kenyans kept in concentration camps by the British. You had people still alive today who were castrated, babies burnt to death in these concentration camps. Now, the case that came into the British courts around that, which was filed by Kenyans still alive today, actually revealed that there was a British policy by the name of Operation Legacy to avoid any type of future accountability. Now, that project was the burning of documents which detailed what Britain did in these territories. Now, that Operation Legacy has also been applied to the education system, whereby you leave the education system simply not having an understanding of Britain's policy around the world. How many people in this country understand what Diego Garcia is? If you were to say to them Diego Garcia, they may think that it was a football player, but it wasn't. It was an island that was depopulated of thousands of people by the British and given to the United States for a military base, which is now a key military base that they use in the war on terror.
Would it be fair to say that neoliberalism or neoliberal empire has a vested interest in preventing people from developing any kind of revolutionary consciousness, such that those who are rioting, for one example, will never see those that they're demonizing or that they view as their so-called enemy as their potential ally?
Essentially, it harnesses, it commandeers the state and uses it for its own interest. When you look, for example, at the companies that plastered flammable cladding, not only on Grenfell Tower, but on buildings all across this country, those companies are certainly not from Afghanistan, they're certainly not from Sudan, they're certainly not from Iran. Those companies are US and European companies. And they plastered buildings across the country with flammable insulation that if a spark was to happen, would burn the inhabitants of those buildings. It wasn't refugees that caused the horrific crisis that took place in the NHS. No, it is US companies. When people look at the problems they face and say, well, it's hard for me to get housing. Well, it's a simple fact that 50% of the land is owned by 1% of the population. Those aren't refugees. When people say it's hard for me to get an appointment with the doctors, that's because you have a political class which is selling the NHS to US corporations. It's not because of the person sitting next to you in the waiting room also waiting for an appointment. And it's certainly not the blame of people that are from states that have been invaded by Britain over the last 20 years and have had their borders dictated to them by the British.
Yes. Just last question before we wrap up. This has been such a fascinating and important discussion, Lowkey. But I'm wondering, in the UK, it's no secret that the tabloid press or industry plays an outsized role. And I'm wondering if you can speak to, more specifically, the role that it plays within this myth making and how maybe it's manifest in these riots right now.
So you look at an individual like Rupert Murdoch, who has constantly been able to tell people that they have everything to fear from the foreign other. This is an individual that not only owns The Sun, Sky News, the Times newspaper, even publishing houses he owns. Rupert Murdoch, for 11 years in this country, did not pay corporation tax, despite extracting billions from the British economy. Rupert Murdoch is somebody who has pushed millions of Islamophobic headlines, and he has everything to answer for what is happening today. It is not simply somebody who's here today and gone tomorrow as a shooting star, as Tommy Robinson is. It's Rupert Murdoch who has actually spent decades of his life producing this type of impression. You also have the Daily Mail, which has literally printed headlines comparing human beings to all manner of animal, has sought to irrationalize this perennial other. When you look at crime, when it is committed by in the eyes of a lot of the mainstream media, a particular section of the population, that crime is pathologized and exceptionalized. When crime is committed by another section of the population, the target section of the population, that crime is generalized, irrationalized, culturalized, and then turned into a rule. And this is the way in which you produce a perception. There would never be a point that Jimmy Savile's activity would be blamed on his race, ethnic, or religious background. However, you have a situation where the numbers have been purposely fiddled in order to create a perception that there's another part of the population who have a predisposition towards a particular type of crime and violence. When even the Home Office's own data, and let's not forget, the Quilliam Foundation was funded by the Home Office at one point. The Home Office came out and said, this extrapolation and this conclusion that you have is incorrect. Suella Braverman, even when she was Home Secretary, came out with a statement which echoed the Quilliam Foundation headline, which was reproduced uncritically. And the Home Office then published a statement saying she is wrong. This does not bear out in the statistics. So we've had a really lengthy and fierce psychological operation aimed at our population. And it's really time that we are able to push back on these myths. We need to read, we need to research, and we need to study in order to do it.
Thank you so much, Lowkey, for this very illuminating, insightful discussion. I'm wondering, just before we wrap up, if you have any final thoughts or observations.
Ultimately, my final thoughts are these. Your enemy is not in a dinghy in the English Channel. Your enemy is in a yacht in the Channel Islands, publishing the newspapers which millions of people read. You have more in common with those that you rely upon daily in your society and those dying in the English Channel than you have with the political, media, and business elites who want to lead you to believe that those people are your enemy. The same people that told us lies about WMD are the same people that told us lies about the RMT. You have more in common with striking railway workers, with nurses, and with teachers in this country, and with refugees, than you have with those disempowering both them and you. The same people that told us lies about WMDs are telling us lies about the refugees that those wars created.
Thank you so much, Lowkey.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.